Welcome to the Alex Salmon Show, where we interview one of the great campaigners of the last half-century. Someone who has graduated from tabloid Target as the most hated man in Britain to a newfound national treasure, with his views now virtually mainstream. Alex interviews Peter Tatchell about his career in political activism before the launch of a new film which tells the story of his lifetime of human rights campaigns. But first, to your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week, where we featured legendary footballer Andrew Watson and the England-Scotland game at Wembley. Alex also spoke with Lou Walker, Ifeoma Dieke, John Barnes, Mark Walters and Jim Spence. Now, Shauneen says, this is a very interesting story. This is, of course, the Andrew Watson story. I've never heard of it before. Yvette says, just shows you how history has been censored. Can't trust anything. Gordon says, watched your previous programme on Andrew Watson. Totally fascinating and an eye-opener on lost history. Keith says, great promo, great backdrops. Colourful muffler too. That, of course, was my Scotland scarf. And finally, Dawn says, brilliant show, very revealing, and that usual humour mixed in. Now, when the film features Sir Ian McKellen and Stephen Fry, and boasts Elton John and David Furnish as executive producers, you might expect people to sit up and take notice. However, this is no ordinary film. Hating Peter Tatchell, which marks the directorial debut of Christopher Amos, is a documentary feature relating the remarkable campaigning life of controversial gay rights activist Peter Tatchell. Let's take a look at a clip.
Punched and kicked by anti-gay protesters in Moscow today.
Someone protect me, someone protect me!
Before being arrested by police.
Being targeted for violent attack comes with the territory.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Tatchell.
Stop homophobia in the Commonwealth!
Peter Tatchell has devoted his life to crusading for homosexuals.
When people in power won't show compassion, sometimes you have to up the ante.
He writes the book on how to do a protest.
Peter is a performance artist.
I am trying to ensure the arrest of a torturer.
He deserves recognition for his extraordinary contribution to the happiness of millions who've never heard of him.
The whole gay community owes you because of your bravery and your courage.
Gay activist Peter Tatchell refused to move on.
Please, no, we are not moving away.
Does Peter have an ego? Yes, you need an ego to perform.
Can you shut up now,
I'm not going to shut up. This is not a free and open debate.
This is the most disliked man in Britain.
From the early days, I thought Peter was a brave mother.
We've tried to play by the rules, it hasn't worked. Now we're going to break the rules.
Peter Tatchell, welcome back to the Alex Salmon Show.
Great to join you.
Now, Peter, the most hated man in Britain, but you're now a national treasure. And to furthermore, you're on Netflix and the film's coming out in August. I mean, goodness, what's happening to you, Peter? Have you gone mainstream?
I haven't changed, but the consensus in society has shifted. And I'm so proud to be part of that movement with, of course, many millions of other people.
Well, the film's fascinating. I've seen an exclusive preview of it, but let's help the viewers. I mean, who was it actually called you the most hated man in Britain?
Let me say that the title, Hating Peter Tatchell, came about because the director, Christopher Amos, when he thought about making the film, was shocked by the scale of hate and vitriol against me. Nowadays, I would say that public opinion has dramatically revised its view of me in the light of my work, not just on LGBT plus rights, but also on human rights in general, because I am a universal human rights campaigner, and I stand to defend the human rights of everyone.
Now, let's go back to where it all began in your life as a protester and campaigner. I mean, back to your native Australia. I mean, your first real campaign there was against Vietnam. I mean, it was the huge issue of the late 60s and early 70s. So that would be right to say that you were a Vietnam protester before you became a LGBT activist.
Well, that's right. I mean, in fact, my earliest awareness was around 1963, when I was 11 years old, and I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. I remember at 11 years of age thinking that was so shocking. And that inspired my interest in and support of the Black Civil Rights Movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. And ever since, his methods and model of activism has been my template. And so when it came to the war in Vietnam, I was in Australia, and Australia was fighting alongside the Americans in Vietnam. I researched what the war was about and concluded that it was a very unjust war. So I joined with others, and many others, to organise a huge mass protest in my home city of Melbourne against the war. 100,000 people turned out to bring the city centre to a standstill. That was almost 10% of the entire population. And it did mark the turning point when the Australian government finally began to think about withdrawal.
So, I mean, most people have read about the anti-war protests in America and how they impacted on American politics. Did they have the same sort of impact in the politics of Australia?
Absolutely. I mean, in the 1960s, Australia was gripped by its own version of McCarthyism, an anti-communist witch hunt where anybody with liberal opinions was labelled a communist. I nearly lost my job because I was seen at an anti-Vietnam War protest. I had to fight tooth and nail to retain it. And that was very typical of the era. But the mass protests of that time to demand Australian withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, that did really fundamentally change Australian politics and led eventually to the election of Gough Whitlam's government in the early 1970s.
Now, you arrived effectively as a refugee, let's say, in these shores. Were you fleeing from the draft, or was it the repressive anti-homosexual legislation which could have seen you jailed?
Well, a bit of both, and it wasn't just the anti-gay laws that existed in Australia at the time, but also other very illiberal laws, the death penalty, the censorship of books and plays, ban on abortion, a woman's right to choose. A whole host of very illiberal measures were in place. But of course, the Vietnam War and my unwillingness to be drafted for that war because I had a conscientious objection, that was the driving force that led me to come to Britain. And I intended to stay only briefly, but the permanent stay...
You're still here?
Permanent stay is here.
And you arrived in a Britain where Harold Wilson had very sensibly kept out of the Vietnam War, but nonetheless there was still repressive legislation against homosexuals. In fact, you coming out at the age you were would have been illegal here at that time as well?
Well, I arrived in London in 1971, aged 19. And although there had been a partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality in England and Wales in 1967, still many aspects of gay male life remain criminalised. And in fact, were not fully repealed until 2003.
And you say male life because lesbianism was never actually illegal, and I'm correct in that, am I?
That's right, yes. There was never any specific legal law against sex between women.
They said because Queen Victoria couldn't countenance the fact that any such thing could possibly have gone on.
Well, that's the allegation, perhaps the apocryphal story.
But you arrived in a society which was changing, and certainly gay rights activity was changing fast in the 1970s. So you arrived in a flourishing gay movement, that gay pride marches were starting, key organisations were starting up as well. So that was a good environment to come to as a gay rights activist.
Well, yes, it was incredibly exciting to arrive in London from Melbourne, Australia, where there were no LGBT plus organisations and where homosexuality was still a criminal offence, punishable by several years' imprisonment in all circumstances. Coming to Britain with the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality and the formation of the Gay Liberation Front was an incredibly exciting personal liberation. To be able to join with other LGBT plus people and fight for our rights, that was a phenomenal, very exciting moment.
Now, what perhaps did distinguish you from other campaigners is you also chose to promote your activism through conventional politics, through the Labour Party, and famously became the Labour candidate in what has been described as the dirtiest by-election of the 20th century, and there's been plenty of dirty by-elections. So Bermondsey in 1983, did it live up to that title? Was it the dirtiest by-election in history?
Well, a lot of commentators at the time said it was the dirtiest, most violent, and definitely most homophobic election in Britain. So that's a sort of badge I wear with pride, but it was very, very tough. And of course, I wasn't just standing for LGBT plus rights. I was standing for everybody's rights, for social justice, for a fairer, more equitable society for everyone.
But were they out to get you because you were a gay activist, or were they out to get you because you were a Red Peter, and the gay attack was just a convenient means of settling your hash?
Well, I was targeted on three fronts. I was targeted because I was born in Australia, even though I can trace my family back to England in 1560 in Somerset. I was attacked because yes, I was a left-wing campaigner, but indeed all the extremist policies that I had are now mainstream. You know, I argued for a national minimum wage. I was told that was extremist. I argued for negotiated political settlement in Northern Ireland. That's now happened. I argued for a Comprehensive Equality Act to protect everyone against discrimination. That is now the law of the land. So, you know, what I stood for then is now the mainstream, and I'm so proud that, you know, I perhaps began a process which helped make that happen.
Because you were the focal point for a number of competing interests who were out to get you. I mean, there was the right wing of the Labour Party. Indeed, the by-election was really set up so as you could be targeted by the resignation of the incumbent MP. The Liberal Party were waiting to pounce on the by-election, the Liberal SDP alliance, as they were then. Real Bermondsey Labour were the kind of street manifestations of raw prejudice, and the mainstream media, of course, perhaps not emphasising the homosexuality, but going for the extremist red tag. They were out to mop you up. So you became the focal point and the target for a number of competing forces, united only in the desperation to get you. Would that be a fair summary?
Well, I don't think they're out to get me, they're out to get the Labour Party. And they succeeded because I lost that election. But I'm very proud that I stood on a comprehensive LGBT plus rights platform with policies that are now the law of the land. I was ahead of my time. I think also that it needs to be said that that by-election, because of the way I was treated by the tabloid press and by political rivals, because of the homophobic way I was treated, that made it much easier for other people like Chris Smith, the Labour MP, to come out the following year. I think there was such a revulsion against the way I was treated, no one dared to heap that upon anybody else. So I made it easier for others, and that's a great positive thing.
And I, of course, became a national figure as a result of that defeat. I mean, the name Peter Tatchell had an influence and a resonance, well beyond Bermondsey as a result of the nature of that by-election. How comfortable was that label for you, the man who lost Bermondsey, or was it the person who was done down and a lot of people rallied to your support?
But of course I feel really sad that I lost that election, not so much for me, but for the Labour Party and Labour Party members who put their trust in me. But on the other hand, I think out of that defeat, I've sought to use my public profile to promote a whole range of human rights issues, from free speech to civil liberties, to employment rights, to the rights of women, black and ethnic minority peoples. I've tried to use the platform for good.
You took your campaigning efforts domestically out with conventional politics and indeed internationally, and that's what we're going to turn to in the second half of this exclusive interview.
Welcome back. Alex is interviewing controversial human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell about his 50 years of activism, which first affronted and then compelled the gaze of media and public alike.
Let me be frank, I don't think Peter was always helping.
If you let me finish. The church for 2,000 years have been saying we're sick and sinful and immoral and we're going to burn in hell.
The Archbishop of Canterbury was interrupted today by a gay rights protest.
Dr. Carey opposes lesbian and gay human rights.
He's a bullying kind of chap trying to get his own way.
Real men don't get insecure about gay men. Real men can cope with it. Scared by a few gay men.
Hey, Peter Tatchell, I'll see you again, you...
What keeps me going is the knowledge that the homophobes who are against me want me to give up.
Now, Peter Tatchell, you had another couple of goes at, well, let's call it conventional party politics and elections, but basically since the 1980s, your real campaigning efforts have been in wider mobilisation, wider campaigns domestically and internationally. Looking back off these, which are you most proud of? I mean, you've done so many, but which ones do you say, right, I'm really glad I did that?
Well, I'm pretty proud that I staged the first ever LGBT plus protest in a communist country in East Berlin in 1973 and was interrogated and arrested by the Stasi, but through that protest helped take the ideas of gay liberation to the Soviet bloc. And when I was there, I distributed thousands of secret underground leaflets.
Which circulated for years afterwards.
That's right.
These were the days, you know, the written word.
Yeah, and it helped trigger the formation of some of the early underground LGBT plus movements in countries like East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on. So I'm proud of that. I'm very proud of the 2 attempted citizens' arrest of President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe on charges of torture. Although I did not succeed, the publicity about those attempts helped shine a spotlight on the human rights abuses that he was inflicting on his own people.
Well, let's talk about the 1999 incident. That was outside a London hotel. Describe the circumstances. Were you sort of waiting in the foyer to pounce on them? How did you go about that?
I got an anonymous tip-off that President Mugabe was staying at a hotel near Victoria Station. So together with 3 other activists, I lay in wait outside his hotel, and when his limousine drove out, we ran in front of it, forcing it to stop. And then I opened the rear car door and placed him under arrest. We then called the police, and even though we showed the legal papers for his lawful arrest under British and international law, we were arrested and he was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods.
And how did President Mugabe take this? I mean, you would have thought with his background, he would have been pretty relaxed about somebody opening his car door, or did he think he was going to get shot?
You should have seen the look on his face. His jaw dropped, his mouth opened, his eyes popped. I think he thought he was going to be killed, even though I held out both hands to show that I didn't have a weapon.
And the second time you tried to arrest him in Brussels, I mean, was it a case of, oh no, it's him again? What happened then?
The second time, when I tried to arrest him in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Brussels, initially he and his bodyguards thought I was a well-wisher coming up to congratulate him. So I got right close, but as soon as I said he was under arrest, I was beaten up and eventually beaten unconscious by his bodyguards.
Was Robert Mugabe as surprised as Archbishop Carey was to see you entering his pulpit?
Well, in the case of George Carey on Easter Sunday, myself and other members of Outrage, we had tried to get a meeting with the Archbishop for 8 years. He wouldn't meet us or with anybody from the LGBT plus community. So we thought, we have to go to his cathedral, and where better than on Easter Sunday, when the event is televised around the world, to challenge him. And so that's what we did. We walked into the pulpit and we simply called him out over his support for legal discrimination against LGBT plus people. He was not just saying that homosexuality was wrong and sinful, he was saying the law of the land should discriminate against us.
Did you get prosecuted under canon law?
No, I was prosecuted under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551, which makes it illegal to interrupt a minister of religion in a place of worship. I could have got fined £5,000 and sent to prison for 6 months, but the magistrate accepted that the protest was brief, peaceful and respectful, and therefore he fined me the princely sum of £18.60.
And were you bound over?
No, not bound over.
I'm interested in the reaction of the congregation, because it was pretty hostile. I mean, it's a Christian congregation. I mean, you know, there are other aspects to you would have thought perhaps, you know, Christ in the temple or something might have come to mind, that people can be unpopular for making a protest at a particular time, and then retrospect and history judges it differently. But that congregation were having none of it, weren't they? They were clapping to get you out, if I remember correctly.
Well, of course, we did not interrupt any of the sacred parts of the service. We waited until Dr. Carey's sermon. And I would say it was justified on the grounds that what is more important, the decorum of a church service or the human rights of people? And I would put human rights first. As we all know, Jesus overturned tables in the temple. I'm no Jesus, but certainly I think direct action, peaceful and non-violent, is justified to defend human rights, even in a church.
Looking back over that long period of activity, there's been some very controversial things you've been engaged in. Not because the subjects themselves are controversial. Many of your views, as we said, are mainstream now. But the decision that you made and others to out people who were closet homosexuals, that caused a lot of angst within the gay community. I mean, looking back, are there any regrets there, or do you think that was the right course as well?
Well, the way we saw it was that outing was queer self-defense. We were defending our community against people who were colluding with a homophobic church and were being hypocritical. You know, they were saying or supporting one thing in public, but doing something different in private. And that's hypocrisy. It's double standards, and we believe it was right to call them out. The consequences of outing were very positive. None of those bishops ever again said anything, as far as I'm aware, against the LGBT+ community, and two of them eventually became allies and supporters.
You've had a consistent line in defence of free speech, and that has brought you under attack from well, some trans activists, for example, when you've defended the right of traditional feminists to argue for single-sex spaces, or the nature of the debate. How would that type of debate affect you? Almost within, it's almost an internal debate within the gay community.
I can understand why trans people are angry, and I support them. You know, but I think the best way to defeat transphobia is not by bans or no platforms, because that doesn't make the ideas go away. The best way is to challenge those people, to put up rival speakers, to organise protests outside their events, to show why they're wrong.
But it's not just no platforming, is it? I mean, virtually anybody who questions total acceptance of self-identification, even from a traditional feminist viewpoint, is suddenly labelled a transphobe on the social media now. Your lifetime as an activist, your half-century and more, have spanned the period from traditional street protests to your circulated pamphlets in East Germany and now into the social media age. Could you see the concerns that if somebody doesn't agree with you, then automatically they're a transphobe, or should be no platform, or should be silenced? I mean, how much angst does that cause you as somebody who's stood up for free speech?
I do get a lot of stick from people whose side I'm on. It's about a difference of tactics, not about principles or goals. And it is very hurtful. I mean, I do get a lot of hate mail from people who I thought were my allies and supporters. But on the other hand, I also get a lot of support. And for me, the important thing which my mother taught me is I must stand up for what I believe to be right. I could be wrong, I accept that, but I'm doing what I believe to be right. I'm following my conscience, and that's all I think anybody can be expected to do.
But for the big film coming up, you've rallied some impressive cast lists to your support. So Ian McKellen is doing the interviews, Stephen Fry is speaking, Elton John as the executive producer. I mean, these are huge names. How gratifying is it to see that sort of cast rallying to your side as they look over your lifetime of protest?
Well, it is gratifying to think that I've gone from the margins to the mainstream. It's great that well-known public figures understand and support my work. But of course, the most important thing is the average person. And that's why I want them to see the film. Their support is the most important to me.
I've got a couple more questions. I mean, this aspect of you becoming mainstream, of the views you pioneered at personal cost back in the 1980s, now becoming generally accepted. It's not kind of worrying this that the establishment say, well, that Peter Tatchell, he's all right here, and we're fine. We'll have him off, demonstrating against President Putin or some international protest. He's all right here now because we can accommodate his views. Is there any sort of niggling worry for you in that?
Right or wrong, I'm staying true to my principles, and I'm still on the cutting edge on so many issues. We all expect political democracy. I'm asking, why can't we have economic democracy too? Why can't we have employee and consumer representatives on the boards of private companies and public institutions like the NHS. Those people have knowledge and skills that could help make those institutions operate more effectively, and it is also simply an issue of democracy and fairness.
And Peter, looking back on this, I mean, you'll hear the words veteran campaigner, veteran human rights activist, and there's 50 years of protest. I mean, do you think, my goodness, has it been half a century and more? Or do you think, what's the next campaign to fight? What's the next mountain to climb? How does Peter Tatchell survey the present scene?
I don't look back much, although this film, Hating Peter Tatchell, has forced me to do so. But I'm always looking forward. Where's the next battle? What's the next justice issue to fight and win? So, you know, I'm ready for another 26 years. I'm 69 now. I'm looking forward to retiring about 95.
And in that case, Peter, we'll be sure to have you back in the show to tell us how you're getting on.
That would be great. And in the meantime, I hope everyone will remember, don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen.
That's a great way to finish.
There is something irresistible about Peter Tatchell's style of campaigning. Uniquely, he has managed to combine doing outrageous things in a civil and courteous manner. There is no doubt that his actions have been designed to be deliberately provocative. There is no more sensitive time for English Christians than the Easter Mass service in Canterbury Cathedral. Russia, during the World Cup of 2018, would not wish to focus on gay rights in Chechnya, while President Mugabe did not expect to be the subject of a citizen's arrest during his Christmas shopping in London. However, part of the art of protest does depend on targeting the moments which are most precious to your opponents to publicise your message and therefore detracting from theirs. This also explains why, despite his mild manner, Peter Tatchell has always provoked strong, even violent, reaction. Above all, the Peter Tatchell story underlines the crucial importance of stamina in political campaigning. From being the most badly treated candidate in by-election history to his accolade as the most hated man in Britain, he now surveys a political landscape where many of his views are regarded as mainstream, even conventional. Whether this restless campaigner is altogether comfortable with that new acceptance still remains to be seen. It would not be surprising if the mainstream media had to dust down their outrage headlines about Peter Tatchell once again. But for now, from myself, Alex, and all at the show, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.